Funding for this program made possible by Toyota, Kentucky Forward, Gateway and Community Technical College, South Bank, St. Elizabeth Healthcare, and the Northern Kentucky Tribune. Thank you for your support.
Hello and welcome, I'm Vicki Pritchard. Among the many stories in Northern Kentucky, few are as rich in history as that of the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport. And no one tells those stories better than those who were in the trenches in the airport's earliest days. For many of them, working at the airport was a life-changing experience, and it certainly chronicles a key moment in history. The story of the airport is essentially the history of air travel in Northern Kentucky. From its extraordinary murals to the closing of 2 terminals, the airport's story is one of new beginnings, change, and most definitely progress. The history of CVG is more than a story of how air travel evolved from the 40s into the jet age and beyond. For 70 years, CVG has been a place where important moments in people's lives have unfolded. In that sense, CVG's history tells the story of Greater Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky as a community. Join us as we look back at some of these shared memories, not of buildings and runways, but of everyday people like ourselves.
You sometimes don't think of Northern Kentucky as being this very innovative place in terms of transportation, but it was a part of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And if you think of how transportation changed, number one, you start with the steamboats on the Ohio River. Number two, you look at that John Roebling suspension bridge connecting Covington and Cincinnati. By far, it is the symbol of this whole metropolitan region. But Northern Kentucky was also an innovator in terms of railroads. And then, of course, you have the leadership that was provided by people in Northern Kentucky to build, to construct this new airport. And all of that comes about after the great 1937 flood inundated Cincinnati's municipal airport, Lunken Airport, along the Ohio River. Through overcoming those, artificial borders or boundaries between counties and cities, and saying that, this is something that Northern Kentucky needs, a major airport.
Well, for a 10-year-old, it was a big adventure coming to the airport. And it wasn't like it is now where you have I-275 and 75. You came up Dixie Highway, and from northern Cincinnati, it was almost a 2-hour drive at times. So once you got to the airport and you saw all the planes that fly over your house every day, it was a real thrill. There was only one terminal at the time. It was the main terminal. And halfway down the main terminal, we were able to walk out with my grandparents out to the gate, and halfway down on the left was a turnstile. And for a dime, you could go up on the roof and watch all the planes in the area. And it was a big thrill.
We moved in the area about 1951, 1952 from New Jersey. My dad was an executive with Ortho Pharmaceutical. They had him going in and out of CVG 2 or 3 times a week. More often than not, he would not take a car to the airport. I think for the longest time we only had one car, so my mom and I would drop him off at the airport. The main terminal, you know, the old pictures you see of the main terminal is a big rectangle. They had, at some point, I don't know exactly when that was, but they had put an extension, a covered walkway that went out to each of the gates. So we would walk out that to whatever his flight was. It wasn't an infrequent occurrence that I would walk with him to his seat on the plane. A few times introduced me to the pilots, who then would show me the flight deck and pin a little, you know, plastic badge on me. Once we got Dad seated on the plane, or when the plane was coming in, and the weather was okay, we could go up to the top. And they had one of those binocular things that you put a quarter in and all this kind of thing. And we could watch the plane fire up each of the 4 engines and taxi out and roar up into the sky. I mean, it was quite an experience for a little guy, you know, 7-year-old at the time. So my memories at that time were, you know, that flying was a whole lot of fun. It was a friendly thing, and I got to see my dad roar into the sky, and it was just an experience that stuck with me all my entire life. To this day, I mean, every once in a while I'll take my little Cessna 172 and call CVG Tower and ask if I can do a touch and go on one of the runways. I've done that several times now, and every time I do, I can't help but think of my dad roaring up into the sky on the Super Constellation. I mean, he's up there permanently now since 1999, but that's what I think of.
They had us where we had to go to a tailor when we got the job there, and they measured us and made tailor-made uniforms, a jacket, a pencil skirt, and a silk blouse. And we even had wings, which I still have. And there was no automated baggage area to take the bags out to the plane or to the back. So there was a double door. That was during the Vietnam era. And so there were a lot of servicemen, and they had those huge duffel bags that weighed a ton. And whether they were regular passengers' bags or whether they were those big duffel bags, we'd take them off the little place between the counters and sling them through those doors as hard as we could so that they'd get through. When a flight was ready to board, they would let me know, you know, down at the gate, they'd let me know that they were ready. And so I would announce the flight for Piedmont. Now, Piedmont went up and down to all these little towns. So it was quite a lengthy announcement. Piedmont Airlines, Flight 636, pacemaker service for Huntington, Beckley, Bluefield, Charleston, Roanoke, Norfolk, and intermediate stations is now boarding at Gate 2. We had TWA on one side of Piedmont and Eastern on the other side, and all the agents got to know each other, and we'd help each other out however we could. You know, it was just smaller, it was more intimate, and you could just interact with people, and nobody seemed to be in as much of a hurry as they do today.
We didn't really have a fire crew. We did have a fire truck. It was an old timer, of course, and it sat right down below the control tower where we had a view of it. Whenever we had an accident or emergency or a potential emergency, it was all manned by the volunteers, and that was all the ramp crew from TWA and American, Piedmont, Lake Central, whoever was handy. They all jump on board, and as many times the thing wouldn't start. You'd look outside and see all these guys pushing the fire truck out of the terminal out to where the emergency was to get it started.
I took a correspondence school while I was going to high school. I traveled to Kansas City, and they taught us how to write tickets, how to operate teletype machines, and that was a long time before computers. The whole operation. They taught you, how to do air bills, how to do tickets, everything that's combined, to make an airline agent. I learned to do everything there was to do, but my whole love was being close to airplanes, so I worked operations. Operations was my thing. I got to talk to the pilots in the airplanes. It was my duty to send the times, so my job was to transmit that information to tell the people downline where the airplane was at all times, and we always know where the airplanes are.
One time in particular, I remember we had a Piedmont Martin 404 coming in from the East Coast, and was having a real bad ice storm. He was trying to land on runway 27, and the lower you get, the heavier the ice was getting. And so when he first came in, his windshield froze over and he couldn't see. He'd circle around, and all the time he said, "Hey man, I got to get in here because I'm getting low on fuel." I was telling him when he should be turning his base leg, and then he took his left elbow and knocked the ice off his window. And when he landed on, I had to tell him when he's over the approach end of the runway, and he landed on 27 just by looking out the left window, which I was glad that was over with. I was very proud of that pilot.
When they were going out to Vietnam, shipping out, you could tell that they were worried or sad and everything. It made me sad. There were so many of them going. And I offered to write them letters if they wanted somebody from home that they'd met to write to them. And I ended up with 12 names, and I gave them my address so that they could send me their address once they got to Nam. And they were in all the different services. So I wrote one letter to each man every week, and I prayed for each of them every day. I met one that I ended up marrying.
Now, when I think back about my first flight, I was probably 8 or 9 years old. When I was a kid, my family and I would drive to Florida every summer from Pittsburgh. It was long, long car trips. So I was very excited about the first time I was able to get on a plane with my family. And so we were about 8 or 9, and it was magical. It was magical.
Probably the biggest memory I have was in 1974. The summer of '74 is when the new Terminal 2 and Terminal 3 were opened, or I guess it was B and C at the time. It was quite an event because Cincinnati had done something nobody else had done, had come up with a whole new design for the airport. And instead of doing vertical stacking with the arrivals, baggage area on the ground level and departures on the top level, they separated it laterally. And the baggage claim facility was out in the parking lot, and passengers came into the terminal, went up the escalator to check in to the ticket counters, but when they returned, they went back out to the facility, which was on the ground level, and the bags went under the streets and came up in bag carousels in the baggage area. And that was at that time was when the murals were brought into play. Murals were added as part of the expansion, and they were in the baggage areas and in the new terminals because there were large walls and they were big, and the airport had been kind enough to save them from extinction during the remodeling of the Union Terminal.
Well, as an airline employee, we would show up and we might have 3 flights to work in an 8 or 9 hour shift. So the idea is you'd show up, work a flight, you'd have 2 or 3 hours before your next departure. So for airline workers, it was a cushy job. You'd show up, work a few hours a day, and go home. But these days, it's quite a bit different with all the increased flight activity, but it is something we enjoy doing. Well, keep in mind that we weren't supposed to get the dogs out of the cages, but if you'd see this little puppy in the cage and was there for a couple hours, we'd water them. Sometimes we'd get them out and pet them, and then that little docile dog would take off across the ramp, and passengers would see 4 or 5 ramp vehicles trying to chase this dog down. 30 years ago, it was nothing to be on a flight from your origin to destination that would stop 9 times. It was kind of the Visit USA trip. Terminal 1 was great. Passengers loved it because they'd show up and the security line was about as long as the Kroger Express checkout. You'd have 1 or 2 people, you'd be on the flight. It was just US Airways and Republic. That was it. Passengers showed up, they were able to get through security, they had plenty of room on board the flight. It was a pleasure to travel. People dressed up, it was an event, they'd get to the airport and have a good time. So when we talk about the golden age of travel, that was it.
And in 1982, I returned to Cincinnati, and I came back, and it was February of 1982, and Comair's corporate offices were actually on the 2nd floor of Terminal 1, right across the hall from the Weather Service. The National Weather Bureau was on one side of the hall, and we were on the other. My office was actually a door top stacked on concrete blocks. The company at that point in 1982 was barely 5 years old, had just gone public the previous year in 1981. But we were very frugal and in order to succeed. And so the offices were simple and useful. We got the job done.
You just can't say enough about what this airport meant during that period, with tremendous growth, a hub, creating jobs and opportunities for people, but also giving people an opportunity to go from here to see the rest of the world. It was pretty easy to do back in those days, and still is. So to see this terrific leadership here that really helped this region come into its own economically and to become that third leg of the Golden Triangle that we talk about in Kentucky.
It was really by faith that I ended up with the position I had in the communications department. It was a lot of fun preparing for it because everything that we did back then was always themed something, some kind of theme. No matter if it's a Caribbean flight or anything like that, we always would theme it, and we would get together and decide how we're going to do the setup and how we were going to decorate. And our team would get together, and it always came out great. And it was so much fun to see the people that were getting on these flights, and they were so excited to go, what's going on here? And we explained to them, well, this is the first flight, and you pick the right flight to go on because we're here to celebrate their inaugural flight. And it was just fun just being able to be a part of that, to see how happy it made people.
Well, I had to keep pinching myself that I was a part of it. I was cleaning houses at the time. That's what I did before I came here. So that's what I was doing. And to think I went from there and we're standing out there like these important people. I mean, we would almost get right up to Air Force One. I mean, we'd be right out there. All that was like unreal for me. You know, the airport they always built it as a small city. And so when the schools would come, didn't charge a dime for the tour. They'd pull up with their school buses. Sometimes we had our own bus if it was a smaller group, take them around. But they would come out and we would show them everything we could show them at the airport of how it was a small city. And the more I learned about it, the more I just loved it. All those things are just a million memories of the people I worked with, You know, the ladies I worked with, I'll never forget or never stop being friends with them.
I actually have two titles. I'm the chairman of the board for the Interfaith Chapel, and I'm also a volunteer ambassador at the airport. And I was here during the 9/11. And I got here before the diverted airplanes started showing up. And what happened was planes showed up here with passengers and baggage that we hadn't planned on. And I would stand at the top of the escalator as the people would come up, and they had this strange look, why am I at Cincinnati? And the worst part was I had a flight that came in from New York, and they asked me, why am I in Cincinnati? And I explained to them about the planes hitting the World Trade Center. And some of them just had to sit down immediately because they told me that they had people that were working there. There were a group of 8 young people that got diverted here on their way to Chicago. So they came up to me and said, we have to get to Chicago. How are we going to get to Chicago? There's 8 of us, and I understand there's no cars or anything left. So what do we do? I says, well, I'm the chaplain. I'll pray for you all, but why don't you stand over there in the corner, sit around, talk about it, pray about it, and we'll see what we can take care of. Well, it wasn't 20 minutes later, a gentleman came up to me and said, are you the chaplain here? I said, yeah. He says, well, maybe you can help me. He says, I had a reservation for a vehicle, so they gave me the last vehicle they had. Well, it turned out it wasn't a car, it's a 15-passenger van. And he says, I don't want to leave here with it empty. I said, well, where are you going? He said, Chicago. I said, have I got the deal for you? So I introduced him to the 8 high school kids that were in the corner. They got together and all 9 of them took off in this 15-passenger van for Chicago. So a lot of bad things happened that day, but a lot of good things came together because people were praying about it. Had an interesting experience just last year. We have prayer rugs in the front. We have the east wall marked. So it's easy for the Muslims to do one of their 5 daily prayers in the chapel, knowing which time they're supposed to be there, which way to pray. So there's a Muslim gentleman up front on the prayer rug doing his prayers, and a gentleman who walks through the door who obviously is an Orthodox Jew, and he wanted to do his prayers. And I said, well, yeah, that's fine, but I tell you, up front right now is a Muslim doing his prayers. And he says, well, that's no problem. He says, I'll just pray at the back of the chapel here, and I'll get my prayers done, and we'll both probably be done and go on our separate ways. So only in America would you see a Muslim up front on his prayer rug praying to Kiba, and a Jewish man in the back of the chapel doing his prayers. And that's why I love being in the chapel here at the airport.
You know, we're blessed with a lot of great assets here. You know, we're positioned very well geographically. We have an airfield that is one of the premier airfields in the country. And we have now a diversified business. We have a nice mix of cargo, passenger, aircraft, etc. And, you know, most of all, we have a great employee base here. We have 400 employees that have a lot of passion, a lot of heart for making CVG succeed.
We sometimes get a bad rap in Northern Kentucky for being fragmented, but this airport shows how we can come together, and when we unite, what things are possible.
It's exciting to watch all the changes at the airport, the progression of the airport, how it's being streamlined, how it's being diversified in the amount of airlines that they have coming in, and I can see nothing but good things for the airport in the future.
The people are just great. I think that the personnel at the airport are just absolutely terrific. I love it.
I think the airline industry is really an exciting field to be in because I met so many people.
People will ask me, well, what do you do as a chaplain at the airport? I said, well, I consider the airport my church and the people going through there my congregation. And what makes it different than your church is my congregation changes every day.
You know, the airport has such a human element, right? Because it is about connecting people. You know, there's nothing better than going through the terminal and you see, you know, grandmother coming in to see the grandchildren she hasn't seen for a long time, or somebody from the service is coming home and the family's waiting there with the balloons and the banners, and it chokes me up every time. You know, and that's really the mission of the airport, right? To connect people so they can either, you know, make a stronger livelihood, make a stronger relationship with folks.
I know that you'll agree that this was one of the most special episodes of Inside Northern Kentucky, and we hope you'll be back for more. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Vicki Pritchard.